Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I have a special guest, Eric Kaufmann, who teaches politics at the University of London. Today we're here to discuss two of his works, How the Religious Inherit the Earth and White Shift. So, to start with, there seems to be a trend in demographic literature, Peter Berger's The Desecularization of the World, and then your work, How the Religious Inherit the Earth, that the proponents of the secularization thesis missed something.
Right, that's correct. I think that, in my, Peter Berger sort of is very critical of the sociological aspect of secularization. I mean, my view is that actually I don't have a huge problem with the mechanism in secularization theory. And in the West, we see more people leaving religion than joining it for many of the reasons that were set out by Steve Bruce and others. But where I'm critical is that I think they just missed the role of population shifts and population change and the role of differential birth rates and the impact that that's going to have long term on the religious picture is much greater, I think, than religious decline. So that's all. It's not that they're wrong, it's just that they've only got a piece of the story, and that piece is a less important part of the story long term. And so that's really where I came to this book. It was very much about trying to say, let's bring demography into the story of secularization. Okay.
Now, another question is there's a very interesting chapter you have in Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth about Israel and how the rise of ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews already have impacted political parties and consuming habits amongst Israel, because the rabbis can say, don't vote for this guy or don't consume this product, and that has repercussions throughout society. Now, in the United States, those trends are not as accelerated as in Israel yet, in part because Israel is a smaller nation. Those changes are more easily manifested. But do you predict a time in the United States in which evangelicals or Mormons or some combination of religious fundamentalists in the United States would be able to exert that kind of soft power in society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's all about the numbers, and it's because most people get religion the old-fashioned way, which is through birth. Yes, there can be secularization or there can be religious revival, but since most people are getting their religion through birth, that automatically sets up a huge link between population change and population dynamics and what's going to happen with religion. And so what I'm arguing in the book very much is two things. One is, of course, that the religious parts of the world is where all the world's population growth is. Like 98% of it is in that tropical belt we call the Global South, which is 95% religiously affiliated. And the parts of the world where there is a very low religiosity tend to have well below replacement birth rates, aging, etc. And so that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that almost nowhere in the world are people who practice religion regularly having a below replacement birth rate. And that's true even in Western countries. So people who go to church regularly, their total fertility rate is at or above replacement in most societies. And so, but then if you take that to the next step, these what I call these closed religious sects who essentially set their face against modernity and have very high fertility, like the ultra-Orthodox Jews with sort of six, 7 kids, even though they have access to education and medicine and everything modernity affords, they reject that, and they lose very few members to the rest of society. So they have this explosive growth rate in Israel, going from a few percentage points in 1962. The latest Jewish third or first grade class in Israel is now a third ultra-Orthodox. That gives you a sense. And also the observant Jews of the U.S. and Britain, a majority will be ultra-Orthodox. Again, this radical transformation by 2050. So yeah, that's happened fastest in Israel. I think it's going to happen in the United States as well, but it's going to take 1 or 2 centuries. You just have to look at, I mean, if you take the Amish population, I mean, I talk about this in my most recent book, with a doubling time of, say, 25 years, you're looking at essentially 300 million Amish in a little over 2 centuries, 250 years. And then if you factor in the ultra-Orthodox, who are twice the size of the Amish, you've got the Hutterites, you've got the Mormons, who don't have as high a birth rate, but it's twice that of the rest of America. All the while, the U.S. birth rate for everybody else is kind of dropping. 2 centuries is probably 150, 200 years. We're going to start to see a major shift, yeah.
All right. As a corollary to that, we have the idea of the demographic winter with Philip Longman, his book, The Empty Cradle, which is, I think, now 15 years old. He mentions an interesting part that due to global, he says, if I remember correctly, global population will peak at around 2050. And that's not due to increased birth rates, but because medicine allows people to live longer, so they're taking longer to die. And what will happen is in the global south, like say in Latin America, there's a lot of concern about Latin American immigration into the United States, but Philip Longman says, well, hold on, their populations are collapsing too. And that eventually there won't be any more Mexicans crossing the border because there won't be as many Mexicans left, period. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think he's right. I mean, you can see the Mexican birth rate is now around replacement, and of course the net flows across the border are now around zero. That is the same numbers leaving as entering from Mexico. That's not Central America, where you still have a somewhat higher. But yeah, these trends are really sweeping the globe. I mean, there's a recent book called Empty Planet that makes that case. I mean, we can argue about whether the fertility stall in Africa will endure. So there are some people who say, well, the fertility rate seems to be sort of stalled in Central Africa around 4 children or thereabouts. But yeah, the general trend worldwide is going to be this decline to below replacement. And I think that's very plausible.
Now, one other aspect in your book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, is this prioritizing of Abrahamic faiths, so Mormonism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Do we see similar demographic trends in non-Abrahamic religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, animism, and indigenous religions?
That's an excellent question for which I really don't have the answer. I mean, I've only really looked at the Abrahamic faiths, which, let's face it, do cover, the majority of the world's population. And there we see these trends. Now, it may be different in the other religions. I mean, some of those other faiths operate somewhat differently. So Hinduism is very much bound up with national identity, and it's kind of a trickier one. So I don't have a clear answer to you. What I would say is that there's a couple of dynamics here. One is the emphasis on traditional women's roles in sort of conservative religious households. The second is attending worship gives you a community, which then gives you a support structure for child rearing. Those are all important factors in increasing the birth rate. But then, of course, you finally, in the more fundamentalist sects, have this emphasis on go forth and multiply, which is, or similarly in Islam, where being prolific is sort of seen as a virtue and sometimes is elevated. So in the case of the ultra-Orthodox, I mean, that is really the mark of your success as a woman. Or in the, if you take the neo-Calvinist quiverful movement in the U.S. and in American Protestantism, similarly, this is a sign from God of being favored as if you have more kids. So that strong pronatalism, which kind of originates, by the way, at least for the ultra-Orthodox, but also for the Amish to some extent, in this idea of wanting to repopulate after a major Holocaust, but then has since taken on a life of its own and become this theological justification for either opposing birth control or just having very large families. So there's a whole set of, there's probably one set of factors that accounts for normal observant religious people having at least replacement birth rates, and then the fundamentalist birth rate being very high is another dynamic related to theology.
Okay. One related topic that I think would be interesting to discuss is one factor that I believe is a reason why a lot of these fundamentalist sects have a high retention rate, as you mentioned in your book, is that, is the collapse of social capital. So Charles Murray, in his book Coming Apart, where he discusses the white middle class, he mentions how social capital over the past 60 years in the middle and lower classes is completely disintegrated in the United States. So, for example, in 1950, if you wanted to leave the Amish community, the opportunity cost was much lower because there were still lots of voluntary societies and robust communities that you could rely on. But growing up Amish today and trying to leave, there isn't this sort of communal connection. And those people who have that are giving up an awful lot when they go out into what the Amish would call the English world. What factor do you think that has?
I think that's really important. One of the things we know about fundamentalism is it's a response to secularism. And in a way, the more intense secularism gets, the more intense fundamentalism gets. It's in some ways because it's a response. And now you're right, the cultural distance is so large say, between these sects and the rest of the world. In some ways, they like it that way because that helps keep people in the fold because the outside world is so strange, and they are so strange to the outside world in a way they wouldn't have been. So the Amish, even the way the Amish have sort of segregated themselves in a way to be within a buggy ride of the community church, that's all relatively recent. Similarly with the ultra-Orthodox, it's happened as the rest of society's become more and more different. They are sort of sticking out more and more. So I agree with you that there is this dynamic in which the more overtly secular society gets, the harder it's going to be for these units to break up and melt back in. So one of the routes that some Amish take is via evangelical Protestantism back into the mainstream. I mean, it's a small number of people, but that is a sort of route that you can understand them taking because it still works via the Bible, something that they know. Whereas to go straight into a kind of very secular world would, I think, be a huge shock. Now, it has to be said off the bat that with all strong religions, there's very high retention because if you leave the Amish, if you leave a very strong fundamentalist sect, you're turning your back not only on a religion on a Sunday, but your family, your friends, your world, everything. So it's an enormous step to take, and that's why there's very limited loss. So you combine high birth rates with limited assimilation, if you like, into the rest of society, and that gives you pretty explosive population growth. And by the way, while everybody else's birth rates are going down, so if you're holding steady, you don't actually have to increase. I mean, the difference between a birth rate of, say, if you have 7 children per woman and everyone else is having, say, 3 or 4, then you might have a sort of almost twice as an advantage. But if you're having 5 kids and everyone is at 1 or 1.5, that's actually a bigger difference. And compounded over time, that makes a bigger impact in terms of percentage of the population. And that's a lot of what we're facing, is that the rest of society's birth rates have gone down so sharply that these sects, all they've had to do is maintain a relatively high birth rate, and their advantage over everybody else is just compounded. Yeah.
Now, to sort of piggyback off a topic we'll get to a little bit later, you mentioned in White Shift that there's this need to give sort of space to more traditional right-wing people so that they feel like they're invested in the current society and as a way to de-escalate the sort of incivility and potential violence. Do you think that within the United States specifically, and maybe Europe and the West in general, that there needs to be a sort of détente with certain fundamentalist elements? Obviously, some are incompatible by definition. Obviously, the Amish aren't, and that has been done. But do you think that would be a way forward for, say, like the Mormons or other maybe fundamentalist evangelicals or Jewish groups?
Do you mean in terms of encouraging a sort of assimilation with those groups, or are you talking about culture wars type of issues?
Yeah, culture wars, like giving them a space in the way that you might give conservative white folks a space.
Yeah, I actually think they largely do have a space. Obviously, there's a lot of animus against evangelicals, but I actually think, say, in the United States, that the bigger divide is more on the sort of ethno-national versus cosmopolitan. That actually, yeah, people kind of didn't like the fundamentalists, of course, but I somehow think it doesn't stick in their throat quite as much as the sort of new division, which is more ethno-national. But yeah, I think there's a willingness certainly to allow religious freedom. I'm not sure that was ever really contested. I think that the points of contention, say, with evangelicals were more around, well, there's obviously the abortion issue, but also school prayer and Office of Faith-based initiatives, and this question about should state welfare be dispersed through religious organizations or should it be dispersed through the state? I think there were a number of areas of conflict, but I'm not sure that the right of evangelicals to be evangelicals was necessarily so contentious, and I'm not sure that they were sort of being pressured to not be religious. I don't know. Maybe I'm not enunciating this correctly, but I didn't think that was sort of the big issue.
All right. One interesting element of an earlier period in demographic studies, in a period when ethno-nationalism was more the norm in the 1920s and 30s, you had Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard. And What's interesting about Stoddard's work is in the passing of the passing of the Great Race was Grant. Stoddard did the Rising Tide of Color. He actually accurately predicts the rise of Islam, and he writes this in the 1920s when nobody thinks Islam is going to make a comeback. And I just wonder if you have any opinion on what they got right.
Well, I wish I could tell you that I'd read them closely, which I haven't. But yeah, Islam, I think we need to make a distinction, say, between the rise of Islam, which has been very noticeable and is almost entirely demographically driven, let's say, in the period since the early 20th century. But what is interesting and important to note is that actually Islam's growth rate's tailing off because of this global population. Well, the demographic transition is come in force to Muslim countries, not just the big ones like Indonesia, but also the Arab world. And so we're seeing the demographic transition taking hold there, and I think that's actually curtailing Muslim growth. I mean, the kind of growth that I talk about in Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth is largely around, growth between seculars and fundamentalists. So fundamentalist Muslims, like fundamentalist Jews, are going to be growing like fundamentalist Christians, but your sort of mainstream Muslim who's perhaps in a society, as it modernizes, as it gets, as education spreads, their birth rates will come down. So I don't think there's anything intrinsic in the Muslim faith that is propping up a higher birth rate, actually. However, the demographic momentum of having entered the demographic transition later means that there is simply a lot of population pressure still to run its course. And of course, in Europe, we know the birth rates were a lot higher. They have come down, but a combination of immigration plus fertility means that the Pew projections have Muslim share kind of almost tripling between now and 2050 in the main West European countries. So yeah, there is going to be a major shift. It's interesting that I didn't know that about Stoddard, but I still think the Muslim world, by and large, will not be an exception to this demographic transition.
Okay. One other aspect is, if you look at the history of the world, so like, for example, the Roman Empire, in the first century, at the peak of its influence and wealth, we already see the beginnings of demographic decline. We have even part of the marriage reforms of Augustus Caesar were to prop up the Roman stock to have more children. So is the current demographic decline we see today, which of course is greatly accelerated by modern technology, is that something radically different from history, or is it a part of a historical cycle of rise and fall of nations as they become wealthier and more secure? They tend to have fewer children, and it's just accelerated now because of modern technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've read some of those old, and it's a discourse even in Islam where they talk about, I think it's Ibn Khaldun, who is in, I think it's the 14th century, but just talking about the same sort of thing, about decadent urban populations having not enough children, or the elite, patrician elites not having enough children, and there are echoes of something similar. Obviously, they didn't have as advanced contraception, but perhaps they didn't have to have so many kids necessarily to work the land. So maybe there were some elements that were similar. I still think if you look worldwide today, there are a lot of very poor countries that are having birth rates below replacement now. If you think about places like Turkey and Brazil, Iran, a lot of these countries that are not rich by any stretch, their fertility rates are now below replacement. So I think but what you describe, of course, is true in a way. If you think about secularism, seculars have the lowest birth rates. So to that extent, there is some connection, I think, between a greater individualism, perhaps, and a greater unwillingness to have large families. But I just think it goes much beyond that, because so much of the world is entering into this below replacement fertility now. It's really only Africa and a few other spots, Pakistan, Yemen, a few places that have this quite high birth rate. So I think there's some truth to that, but I think it's only part of the story.
Okay. Well, some recent studies that the new atheists and more secular-minded people like to point out is that younger people are walking away from organized religion in greater numbers. But is there any correlation between getting older and or getting married that leads those people to then come back to religion?
Yeah, this is a big debate that a lot of people had, and in Europe as well. And I'm not sure there's a clear answer to this. We need that longitudinal data where we track people's religiosity. And I guess in Europe we have better data on that, but it's still, I don't think there's strong evidence yet to show that there's going to be a big return to faith in the older ages. It's very cohort-based, so the older generation, is very religious, but they were religious when they were younger. So I don't think yet we can say that there's a lot of evidence for a major return to faith. Again, in my book, I'm mainly talking about the fact that it's demography and population change that's driving the return of religion. And so, for example, London, these major immigrant gateway cities in Western Europe are the religious hotspots of the country. So religion, people who say they have a religion, that's dropped, 40+% in the rest of England and Wales. In London, it's been pretty stable. And maybe next census we're going to see London actually have fewer secular people in it than they do today. So this is, again, and this is all driven by immigration of religious people into secular places. So I think that's the mechanism. I'm not sure about a return. I think that's it's certainly too early to make that determination.
Okay. Shift gears a little bit to your new book, White Shift. What was sort of the inspiration for White Shift, and what do you hope to accomplish in the book?
Right, so there is a connection, obviously, through the impact of population shifts on society and culture and politics. But the new book, White Shift, which is on immigration, populism, and the future of white majorities, that's much closer to the kind of research I've been doing in my career going back 20, 25 years to the beginning. Really, my first book, which was on the U.S. and the decline of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominant group in the sort of early to mid 20th century, going into the second half of the 20th century. So that's always been a kind of the major research interest of mine, is this confluence of immigration, demographic change, national identity. And I've been interested in particular in the concept of majority ethnicity or dominant ethnicity, which is something distinct from the nation. It's sort of the largest ethnic group in a country. And in the U.S. case, it used to be the WASP group, and now has morphed into the kind of white group. And that's, that I think is really what's happening in Europe as well, that the ethnic majorities are in decline as a percentage of the population. And that sort of underlies the populist moment, if you like. It's in the background of everything that's happening on populism and polarization. And I think it's really going to be the driving force of a lot of politics in the next few decades.
Now, there was a video a few years ago that was sort of an alt-right style video about the Islamic takeover of Europe. I think it was called Eurabia. That stirred up a lot of controversy. So what are the facts of the matter on your Islamic migration displacement into Europe?
Well, yeah, so essentially the Pew numbers, which I was involved in an earlier iteration of, and I think are the most reliable. An example of the kind of shifts that we're looking at, say to 2050, Britain will probably go from about 6% Muslim to about sort of 16, 17%. So it's almost a tripling. I would say many West European countries will go through a sort of 2 to 3-fold rise to 2050, but I don't think beyond that, it's not clear that we're going to see continued growth to, say, majority status. I actually think that for a number of reasons. One is that the Muslim birth rates have largely converged with that of other religious groups and seculars in the population. Secondly, the nature of the immigration flows is predominantly non-Muslim, so even if the country's population was entirely composed of immigrants, it doesn't matter, it would still not be majority Muslim. Without the high birth rates, there's not a scenario that will get you to Muslim majorities. And then we've got, lastly, I guess, the issue of Muslim intermarriage and secularization, which is relatively small in this country, in Britain, but in France, for example, it's 40 to 50% of Algerian, Moroccan, which are the main groups, outmarry. And so with that high outmarriage rate, it's not going to make an impact in the next few decades, but longer term it'll have a bigger impact in reducing. And we know that the offspring of those mixed marriages, of mixed marriages between, say, Muslim and a non-Muslim, tend to gravitate to non-religion. And so I think long term there's not going to be a Muslim majority in Europe.
Now,
That'd be my prediction.
okay. Now, I wonder if this thought is explored further in White Shift. In Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, you mentioned in this section on Europe that European secularization is actually nearing its end, and that by like 2030 or 2040, the Europeans that will be secular already will be, and then those that won't be will become associated with some of the rising fundamentalist groups like fundamentalist Catholics in France or fundamentalist Calvinists in Holland. So this, I guess, a twofold question. To what extent will the white majority that's left in Europe be driven by these fundamentalist groups? And are these fundamentalist Christian groups within the white community, how do they stack up population-wise right now against the Muslim immigrants?
Right, so I think a lot of what you're right. So you've got a growth of the charismatic component, even within mainstream, say, Anglicanism. And I agree. I think that rump will become more self-conscious and will eventually start not to lose so many people. We already see this in Scandinavia and France, where this sort of secularization is tapered off and is now no longer occurring. So by mid-century, I'm sort of predicting that the flattening out and eventually the return of religion through demography again, mainly. This is not going to be a large group, though. I mean, I would say that the Muslim share would be considerably larger than the fundamentalist in most Western European countries. Now, the Netherlands might be an exception because of the conservative Calvinists there. I don't know their share. I think it's still quite a small share of the population. Finland is another place that has a very strong sort of the Laestadian Lutherans who have a very high birth rate, again, like the Orthodox Calvinists in the Netherlands. So both of those undoubtedly will be a much more important force going forward, but I still think are smaller, at least certainly in the West European countries. I think they're relatively small compared to the Muslim share. So only a few percentage points, really.
All right. So in White Shift, so both the left and the far right are both very animated about this displacement for opposite reasons. The far left loves it, and the far right despises it. What do they get right about this displacement, and what do they get wrong?
Well, okay, so I think there definitely is an ethnic shift going on, and it's just, for example, if you just have to look at the numbers, if you look at the fertility rates of the ethnic majority populations, you look at the immigration rates, it's a question of when you start to see the ethnic majorities become a minority. So we know in the U.S., I mean, we could talk about definitions of who is white and who isn't white, but roughly the 2040s or 2050, this is expected to happen. That's going to be true in Canada and New Zealand as well. Europe, it's going to happen later, mainly because the ethnic majorities are larger and the immigration rates are a bit lower. So it's sort of going to be, in Britain's case, in much of Western Europe, end of the century, I'd say, rather, as a rough rule of thumb, depending on the country. And so that is going to happen, and it's very noticeable. So the question, I guess, with the far right is on speed of change. I think they are exaggerating the speed. So talking about Muslim majorities in 2050 is clearly, the Muslim share might be in Europe might be on the order of 10 to 15% rather than 50s, right? So I'd say that's probably what they're getting wrong. It's interesting. I don't think the left. I mean, they have a sort of multicultural utopia, but I'm not sure they set numbers on it, and they don't necessarily think that deeply about when these things are going to happen, except for cliches like the Browning of America 2050, etc. But yes, it is definitely happening. Now, of course, the question is going to be, the other issue is going to be around, well, how do we define the ethnic majority? If we define it on strictly phenotypical racial category grounds, then yes, there's no question that those declines are happening and they will continue to happen. If, however, there is a way of blurring the boundaries, if you like, for the ethnic majorities, then they could potentially retain their share of the population, especially second half of the century. Yeah.
All right. Now, as far as what the media has termed the alt-right, what concerns of theirs do you think are legitimate? Because that's really the interesting question, because I think we know what the MSM say is illegitimate. But what do you think are there, if any, legitimate concerns that they have?
Yeah, okay, so this is where I sort of part company with a lot of my academic colleagues, is that, first of all, I think it is I just don't think you can argue that ethnic majorities and minorities are treated equally in terms of cultural recognition, the right to express an identity, the right to defend interests, for example, and that there is a toxicity around, talking about whiteness or white majorities. This certainly doesn't exist talking about blackness or Chineseness or whatever. So there, I think the alt-right point is absolutely germane, and I think the mainstream is making a huge mistake by trying to pretend that that's not true, and because people know it's true, and therefore they can say, okay, yes, the alt-right's actually, I can't deny that this is going on, so I believe that, and I'm being told something different by the mainstream. Maybe I'm going to believe the alt-right, and then they can put on what I think are the untruths, which is around sort of, a Jewish globalist conspiracy to commit white genocide, and some of these sort of theories about, conspiracies and people getting together with this vision of eradicating the white race. I mean, I don't think any of that's happening. I think it's all much more. It's much more immediate. People are just thinking in sort of presentist terms, and they're not really considering necessarily the long term. But I certainly think when it comes to the validity of expressing ethnic identity, cultural identity, and acting in a group interest, there is a double standard. So there's a way, and some of this stems from the origin of culturalism in the 1910s in the United States, by the way, where this was conceived of by someone like a Randolph Bourne, who was a member of the Young Intellectuals. This was a bohemian modernist group of liberal left intellectuals emerging, and his view, which really I think is the view that characterizes multiculturalism today, is that we want members of ethnic majorities to slough off their culture because it's uninteresting, confining, repressive, parochial, you name it. They should be individualistic and be samplers, if you like, of other cultures. So they should be cosmopolitan, but on the other hand, ethnic minorities, we don't want them to assimilate, because that would be horrible. They would be trying to assimilate into this valueless culture, which is of no interest and is very boring. So instead, what we want them to do is be conservative and be very ethnic and be very much retaining their culture. And in Bourne's words, he wanted the Jew to stick to his faith and not to become a cultural half-breed. That was the term he used for secular or assimilated Jews. And so you have that contradiction, right, between the value of preserving tradition on the one hand and the value of overcoming tradition on the other. And the way they resolve that is, okay, the white majority, you've got to overcome your tradition, and the minorities, you've got to keep your tradition. But that equation doesn't work, because the problem is there are people who are psychologically wired to want continuity of tradition and to want order and, who want the past to be like the present to be like the past. And those people are distributed evenly within each ethnic group. So you've got minorities who want to slough off their culture and become cosmopolitans, and you've got majorities who actually would like to retain their ethnicity and their sense of community. And so this isn't really working. And so we're starting to see a lot of the tensions as the population dynamics, as this demographic shift. A lot of those tensions are coming to the surface now. And I just think it's untenable to keep on with this duality, actually.
Mm-hmm. One other related question is, we see with studies that East Asians and Latinos tend to integrate fairly rapidly into the broader U.S. culture. I don't know how many of them go to Europe. I think some from the Caribbean go to the UK, like Jamaica. How easily do Muslims integrate into the broader European culture? Is it similar to the Latino East Asian, or is it slower? Is it faster?
Oh, it's certainly slower. I mean, it's because you've got also a culture, you've got a religious difference to the mainstream society. That's obviously going to add another layer. What one of the sociologists, Ernest Gellner, calls a counter-entropic. It prevents assimilation and melting. However, having said that, it depends on which Muslim group. So we know that in Britain, for example, Muslims are more likely to marry whites than to marry each other. When I say Muslims, I mean Bangladeshis are more likely to marry whites than to marry Pakistanis, and certainly to marry Hindus. So I think, it depends on the country. France has, because of the history of who migrated there, it's North Africans who tended to be leaving a very Islamist type of Arabist culture. Maybe they sided with the French in the colonial period for whatever reason, or they're Berbers were more secular. They seem to have a very high rate of mixing, which is not unlike, the Hispanics in the U.S. On the other hand, particularly the South Asian groups, Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, have a very, very limited intermarriage, very low secularization. Some of this stems from the fact they're from particular pockets within those countries that tend to be very traditional. So there's cousin marriage, a significant cousin marriage issue in Britain. So it depends. I wouldn't say blanket, it's hard to generalize completely, but it depends on which Muslim populations there are in the countries. I think France is probably in the best position in terms of assimilation of Muslims, and I think Britain is in a less advantageous position. But yes, overall, because of that religious difference from the mainstream, on balance, you're going to get a lower rate of assimilation.
Now, one aspect of this great migration into Europe from the Middle East, primarily through Libya and Syria, to what extent would it be more helpful to view this as something similar to the Germanic migrations of the 5th century, the Arab migrations of the 7th, the European transatlantic migrations from the 16th to the 20th century? Do those provide a more helpful model than some of the more politicized and conspiratorial aspects we see today?
Well, I think there are obviously similarities in the sense you have demographic and economic push factors and pull factors. But I think in a world of controlled borders and surveillance technology, countries can control immigration, actually. If there's a political will, it's very much within the power of Italy to not allow any boats to land. So it becomes much more of a choice, a cultural and political choice. So I think some of those examples you cited where this was in an age before border control and surveillance, because of the high level of control countries have today, and they really do. I mean, Singapore has complete control over who enters. It's very much a political choice. What do countries want to do? So Germany made the choice. It wasn't inevitable. They made a choice to allow those people to enter their country, and that was a political choice. So it's in their control. All of these things are within the control of the countries, whereas I'm just not sure how easy it would have been to necessarily, with the technology that existed, to control, say, the Arab conquest or the Viking conquest. I think that would have been much more tricky.
So another interesting point that you brought up in your book is that the left, the mainstream media, seems to want to say that, for at least for the sake of white people, that love of one's ethnicity and culture and heritage is implicitly xenophobic. But you say that there are studies that show that love of one's ethnicity, culture, heritage does not actually correlate with xenophobia. Maybe you could explore that a little bit.
Absolutely. That actually, and this is a finding in psychology, a repeated finding, by the way, that attachment to in-group and dislike of out-group are separate orientations that are not generally correlated. They only correlate when you are in a zero-sum struggle. So for example, if you're in the United States and you're a liberal, the stronger you identify as a liberal, the more you dislike conservatives, and vice versa. So those identities are mutually exclusive because they're in conflict. Whereas, and this is from the American National Election Study in 2016, if you're white and you feel very warm to white people on a 0 to 100 thermometer, the warmer you feel to white people, if anything, you feel slightly warmer to black people. So it isn't the same as with conservative liberal, where the more warmth you have to liberals, the cooler you are to conservatives. That's that kind of zero-sum identity where it's in conflict. So most identities follow that sort of what I said about whites and blacks, where attachment to own group is not correlated with hatred of the out group. And actually these behaviors, the attachment to in group is something that develops at an early age as a kind of extension of attachment to mother and family. Whereas you learn hatred of the out-group at a slightly later stage of development. So that's the first thing, and you're absolutely right that there is a tendency, certainly on the left, to conflate these two with regards only, however, to certain groups. I don't think they would say a black person who identifies as black is inherently going to dislike whites more because they don't. Again, it's the same for all groups. But somehow, with regard to whites, there is that perception. And again, this gets back to this whole toxicity that's developed around whiteness, which is related to, I mean, of course, in the past, we do know that, whites did a lot of bad things, and race thinking was associated with Nazism, for example, eugenics, etc. And my only point here is that I think that groups should own up to things that they did in the past, but at the same time, all groups, almost every group has episodes in the past. You can look at what the Mohawks did to the Hurons, or what the Maori did to the Moriori tribes, or the Comanches did to the Apaches, right? So we've got these. All groups tend to have this history where they were the oppressors and then they were oppressed, etc. And so it seems to me a bit odd to just focus on the episodes where your group was the oppressor. And so that's partly where I'm saying, we have to create space for a moderate expression of white identity. And incidentally, I should say that just did smaller scale survey work I've done, attachment to ethnicity amongst white people, say Irish, not the Southern and Eastern, interestingly, but the Northern and Western European ethnic origins, like German, Irish, British, etc., or if people say American. That is heavily correlated with attachment to white identity. And so part of my argument here is this is fundamentally about an attachment to group symbols, to group identity, and not sort of a desire simply to be on top and powerful and get more money. This isn't just about a vehicle for instrumentally enriching yourself or maintaining some kind of power hegemony, which tends to be the way that's approached, I think, certainly in the academic literature. And so I'm trying to sort of take that on a little bit and say, well, hold on a minute, people have attachments to myths and symbols of ancestry. This is really what ethnicity is all about. And it's not such a big leap to imagine that majority groups have that same attachment as minorities.
Mm-hmm. Now, one aspect of I think both of these books that is not necessarily touched on, but is influenced by, at the end of your book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, your closing line is, it looks like the religious will inherit the earth. And by the religious, you mean the more fundamentalist strands of the religion. So in an increasingly illiberal world, what does this mean for already existing liberal establishments, and what methods or options are available to them to sort of navigate this world and make alliances of convenience and security with this increasingly illiberal, post-liberal world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a real dilemma, right? Because if you are a true liberal, you also believe in religious toleration and liberty. People can believe what they want. What happens when you get a group that is illiberal in a way? Should liberals tolerate illiberalism? And that is sort of one of these dilemmas. And you can see in the past where the United States government marched into the U.S. marched into Utah and closed down the theocracy, the polygamy, and everything that was existing there in the 1850s. So they took the view that this is something we're not going to permit. And so they decided to transgress the liberal principle in order to keep illiberalism down. And that's really going to be the challenge. What will a liberal society do? What is Israel? I mean, a good test case is Israel. When the ultra-Orthodox become a majority, I mean, what is the rest of Israel? Now, granted, you've also got a religious Zionist strand, which is reasonably in the middle. But what is the secular Jews founded that state, and they're going to lose that state. And so what are they going to do? They still believe they can integrate the ultra-Orthodox somehow into the mainstream of society. They're hoping that's going to happen. But what if it, I'm very much more skeptical about that. So they're going to face a choice as to how to handle this rising demographic, which will eventually, once they hit 18, be able to vote. And once they hit the median voter of age 40 or whatever, they will have power. They already control Jerusalem. So what are you going to do? I think it's going to be an interesting test case that will prefigure the kind of dilemmas that what other Western societies will face, because you're either going to have to contravene your own principles of liberalism in order, I don't know how it would work. You would either have to, or you might imagine a situation where there was just a nice equilibrium, where there was just enough people from the high birth rate groups defecting to the liberal society to replenish it demographically and to keep the society in balance in that equilibrium. But I think that presumes the problem, in a way, is the fundamentalist birth rate is too high for that to actually occur. So I think these societies are going to have to will face a challenge. Do you compromise your own principles to keep illiberalism down, or do you actually just essentially allow them to prevail?
So in the same way that the whites are perceived as becoming a minority by many liberals, and in the same way that evangelicals in some sense are a minority, how do you think liberal attitudes will change when they become the minority? When most of society no longer agrees with their liberal values, and now they're in the same boat as the evangelicals?
Right. So there's a couple of things here. One would be if liberalism allies with, so you can imagine, say, secular nationalism or ethno-nationalism, some sort of nationalism which is secular, being the driving force for essentially curtailing the, it could get quite oppressive. It could be that they decide, no, we're actually going to oppress this threat to prevent it from taking over our society. So that would be one option. But if liberals say, okay, now we're the majority, we just have to accept it. Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I guess you would have to try to secede or try and plead for some sort of special dispensation to carry on your sort of secular life. In Israel, what's happened is the seculars have left Greater Jerusalem for the Greater Tel Aviv area. There are nationalist parties. Yair Lapid is one of them, who represent the sort of anti-ultra-Orthodox strain that are sort of secular nationalists that are saying, no, we've got to cut off money to them. They are very worried. So that is sort of one response, it's kind of secular nationalism to try and combat the threat. But the other might just be, okay, fine, they're going to be the majority, but we just want to have our rights.
So maybe it's going to be a hard one. Maybe the Amish are the way to look forward to. See how they survive.
Yeah, maybe it'll be a sort of a secular version of the Amish, right? In a religious society, but you have a space for secularism. Of course, the problem, in a way, the other possibility is it could be a divide and rule, where you have one religious group pitted against another religious group, and that tension allows the seculars the space to serve as kingmaker and therefore keep a space for themselves in this increasingly religious society.
What do you think it is about secularism and liberalism that leads them to be less adaptive to have children vis-a-vis their fundamentalist state nationalists?
Okay, so I think it's in. I mean, we know that the mechanism behind natural selection is demography, being able to have more children that survive. So this demographic mechanism. And what we have in this case are certain cultures that are adapted to flourish in an environment that we're in today. So the model that really works is to wall yourself off, to have high birth rates, to limit loss to the outside world. The evangelical model of proselytization actually is not anywhere near as successful. They lose a lot of people. Their birth rate is actually not that high. It's not the evangelicals who are growing. It's these closed fundamentalist sects. That's the sort of evolutionary successful model. What is it? Well, clearly being collective-minded is an advantage in today's environment. But if the environment changes, so clearly under the Nazis, being ultra-Orthodox was actually the worst thing to be, because you were identifiable. That's the group that suffered the most. Whereas secular Jews, my grandfather got out of Czechoslovakia. The people who could adapt and more or less blend in were favored overwhelmingly. But once you move into a situation of, say, liberal multicultural toleration and affluence, then the selection pressures change, and I think that then favors these kinds of groups. If we were to move into an authoritarian mode once again, I think those groups again would be would be easy to pick off, and so they would not be favored. So it just depends on which environment we're in. But in the current sort of environment, then yes, I think the environment is such to favor groups who reject individualism, reject the below replacement fertility which comes with that individualism, are obviously going to be favored, and who retain children in the tradition. They're going to be favored over those who essentially are cultural consumers who sample different things but don't perpetuate a tradition.
Okay. As a related topic, within a certain subset of evolutionary studies, there's the study of human demographics via natural selection. E.O. Wilson is in part looking at that, and more specifically with the adaptability of religion as an evolutionarily adaptive technique that certain societies have developed. And the Jewish demographer Michael Bloom from the University of Jena writes, "It is a great irony, but evolution appears to discriminate against atheists and favor those with religious beliefs. Most secular societies or communities that have espoused atheistic beliefs have not survived for more than a century." Do you find that somewhat ironic that those people who profess not to believe in Darwinism, the Mormons, the Muslims, the super Orthodox Jews, are the ones that are better adapted to survive than those who claim to believe in the theory?
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, you're right. I take your point, but again, I think it depends on. It is ironic, but I think it depends again on what kind of environment we are talking about. I mean, you can see societies even today. If you look at Burma, I mean, Myanmar, they told the Rohingya, well, you can have 2 children, that's it, right? So, or China says there's a one-child policy, and that's it. So, in an authoritarian, if you had an ultra-religious group in China that was growing by leaps and bounds, the Chinese would just say, if they thought that was a threat, they'd say, okay, you can have 1 kid and that's it. Right. So you can see that it very much depends on that this kind of religion is very much evolutionary adapted, but only to liberal societies, and not to, or probably liberal secular societies, because if the society was more religious, then you might have more defection from these ultra-religious groups, because there would be a gateway for them to go into the mainstream society. So in a way, it's the more liberal and secular the society, the better the environment for the expansion of these closed religious sects. But it's not always adaptive, is what I'm saying. So in another world, in the world of the authoritarian state, it could be the worst thing to be, right? So that's just worth mentioning.
Now, one last question I have is, if we look at, say, the United States as an example, we start with this sort of WASP, millenarian religiosity, and then we sort of peak in like the first half of the 20th century, and then we sort of have this replacement of the WASP, this secularization. The millenarianism persists, but in a more secular form, and population declines. Now, at least amongst the WASP elite, though, of course, immigration keeps that up. And in many ways, you could see a sort of similarity with the Romans. The Romans reached their peak in the 1st century. Their population begins to decline. They have to make up with that with the Germanic barbarians over the wall to come in to help keep the population up. Is this a sort of like perennial trend that just cycles? People sort of walk away from the values that initially made them so successful, and then that leads to a sort of degeneracy, to quote Spengler, and then they just kind of slowly decay until another more virile society replaces them?
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the what you read in Khaldun and Cicero, and I think there must be some truth to that. I remember, who was it now? The history of Western philosophy. Bertrand Russell was talking about this, that societies have 2 opposite dangers. One is sort of ossification from too much reverence for tradition. They get locked, like Imperial China. It stopped exploring the world and it became inward-looking, and then that meant that it wasn't able to catch up to the West, or it fell behind the West. On the other hand, you have individual liberty and the dissolving of communal bonds, leading to a kind of, well, it doesn't have to be anarchy, but it just means that you no longer are replenishing that tradition. I mean, I think that latter would be more appropriate to now. But of course, what's tricky about this is the religious and the secular don't necessarily move together. So you might have East Asia, which I think is pretty committed to its ethnic tradition, but has the world's lowest birth rates. So they're kind of, on the one hand, they haven't embraced that Western individualism, the cosmopolitanism, but on the other hand, maybe because of the loss of religion in some way, they aren't having the replacement birth rates. On the other hand, you have maybe the United States, which for whom religion lasted longer, I guess you could say. Religion was more vibrant, but maybe the ethnic tradition decayed sooner. And in fact, you see, for example, with the religious right, they were very much a cosmopolitan movement, at least at the elite level. And in fact, the Vatican and many of the kind of religious elites tend to be quite universalist, and it's all about the text and about spirituality, and it's not about tribes. So they would favor some of those verses. There's neither Jew nor Greek, or some of the Quranic verses that are very anti-nationalist would be popular. So I think there can be somewhat different dynamics here, but I think that there is some truth to what you're saying, is that societies can go through these cycles of being more reverence for tradition, less reverence for tradition. One thing I'd say about the Western trajectory, however, is it does seem to me anyway that this trend toward individualism in the culture, which Daniel Bell, the sociologist, called antinomianism, rejection of tradition, seems to be quite new. I think there's some truth to that. That societies can go through these cycles of being more individualistic, but in the West, this has been particularly pronounced, let's say, since the late 19th century, early 20th century, where what we see, if you look at art, abstraction in art, rejection of tradition in art, I mean, that's quite novel in a world historical setting, and the sort of rise of this bohemianism, this lyrical left, which Bell talks about, which kind of goes mass in the 1960s with the expansion of universities and television, that sensibility, that kind of anti-traditional, antinomian, modernist sensibility, whatever you want to call it, I think that's quite distinctive and quite unique. So even though, yes, in history we see this pattern, I think there's also something unique to the post, the 20th century and thereafter in the West is taking this to a new level.
All right. Well, we're nearing the end of the allotted time. Thank you very much for making time for me today. Do you have anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Not at all, Todd. Thanks. I enjoyed the conversation very much, and just again, the book's called White Shift, and I do encourage everybody to check it out. And thanks very much, Todd. This has been great.
All right. Well, thank you. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.